right? People who print artificial cells with toner cartridges. You have people who print ARFIDs with toner cartridges. You have people who print sheet cakes. You ever seen one of those cakes with a picture of your kid smiling on the top? Sheet cakes with toner cartridges. What if instead of trying to restrict the value that you can get out of a toner cartridge, they tried to expand the value and make a stronger case for owning a certain toner cartridge by taking that intelligence that they're building into it now and letting the audience create more value? The way that today a PC's value is very little about the value that was added by the hardware manufacturer and almost entirely about the universe of services and programs and people you can connect to using their equipment. And now we're seeing it in cars. So it's not you who gets the EULA, but it's the mechanic, because your car has an obfuscated interface for talking to the engine, oftentimes, and a mechanic needs a special piece of equipment in order to talk to your engine. And when she does that, she signs an agreement that says she won't order parts from anyone except the manufacturer, right? So something that no statute would ever allow. If a manufacturer went to the Congress and said, we would like you to give us a monopoly not just on cars but on aftermarket equipment that might go into a car so that we can prohibit people from installing third-party equipment into the car, Congress would laugh them out because this is clearly bad for competition, right? We're supposed to have a this is a planned economy, or worse, it's a kind of throwback to the old feudal system where the king would give his favored subjects, a monopoly on the production of silver ribbon or the color blue or, printing of the almanac. This is that kind of throwback, and no Congress would give it to them. But by adding a EULA, you can create this kind of private law. And really, what company wouldn't love to be able to write their own laws, enshrining their own business models into law? Your expense, at their customer's expense. And if all it takes is to put a sticker on the outside of the box that says, by breaking the sticker, you form an agreement, then who will refrain from doing it in the long run? Now, it's not just EULAs. The anti-copying, anti-use technologies that are sometimes called digital rights management technology, or God help us, copy protection. Now, I assume most of you are sysadmins or have been at one time in your life. Have you ever protected data by not copying it? Right? I my data by having an encrypted backup of it on a server in Australia. So if the hemisphere goes, my data survives, right? Now, these technologies are presented as technologies to keep honest users honest. Now, Ed Felton at Princeton says that's like keeping a tall user tall. The reason for that is that honest users, that is to say people who are naive or honest or moral enough to consume media that they buy instead of media they download from peer-to-peer networks, those people are the only people who get anti-copying measures in their media. In other words, if you decided to download a CD from eMule or whatever the kids are using these days, you're not going to get a rootkit from the music that you've downloaded. On the other hand, if you were to buy that CD from Sony, you might get a rootkit, right? So this isn't so much about keeping honest users honest as keeping honest users means, right? The people who haven't opted out of the system are the ones who get punished by the anti-copying measures. Now, ironically, this builds the case for opting out of the system, right? How many rootkits do you need to get before you say spending money is a foolish way to acquire media? Now, it's also built on a broken security model. It's built on a model that treats the owner of the hardware as an attacker. Now, first of all, as a technical matter, that's extremely difficult to pull off. The idea that you can restrict someone who's got physical access to the hardware in the privacy of their own home from gaining access to secrets embodied in the hardware is implausible in the extreme. But moreover, as a moral prospect, designing equipment that treats the people who shell out money for it as attackers of the equipment is bad for business, and it only works when everyone does it. And of course, when you have a copyright and you can say, I will only authorize people to play my on their hardware if they agree to treat the owner of the hardware as an attacker, well, maybe you can, in fact, construct one of these airtight bubbles in which everyone who sells hardware designs it so the owner is treated as an attacker. You never so we treat the Sony rootkit as an aberration. We say, my goodness, they sure did lose control of their senses when they installed that rootkit on those millions of computers. Dan Kaminsky, who's, if he's not too hungover, now. He found 500,000 networks that were infected by the Sony rootkit, including military and government networks. And we treat that as a kind of crazed excess on the part of, sort of coked up Hollyweird fat cats who lost control of their senses for a moment. But in fact, that's not aberrant. That is, the fact that there is a rootkit in the DRM tells you what the DRM is for. Now, why do we install rootkits on people's computers? We install them because we want to inflict policy on a computer against the owner of the computer's wishes. We want to inflict policy that the owner doesn't want to see running on it, even when the owner wants to do it. Right? So we try to do that, and in order to do that, we need to have software that hides itself from the user. We need to have software that the user can't uninstall. We need to have software that treats the user as an attacker. And there's a reason that the Sony rootkit did the same thing that people who want to turn your computer into a botnet do. The reason that the Sony rootkit owned your box. And the reason is because DRM is all about owning your box. It's about this idea that while you're playing someone else's record on your record player, it stops being your record player and starts belonging to someone else. It's not something we ever had in copyright law. Copyright law is supposed to be about who can copy your works, not who can design a technology capable of copying your works. Now, you can never secure a computer by designing it to enforce remote policy against the user. Right? I'm a science fiction novelist mostly these days, and as a result, I'm keenly attuned to dumb things that happen in science fiction media. And the dumbest of all is the self-destruct button. Right? Every now and again you'll see this in a movie. My goodness, they've tripped the self-destruct button and we have 30 seconds to get off the ship before it explodes. And you got to ask yourself, why'd you build a self-destruct button into your rocket ship? Gosh, that seems really dumb. Right? Wouldn't your rocket ship be safer if there wasn't a single command that could make it explode? Well, why are we designing computers that can enforce remote policy against their owners? Wouldn't the computer be more secure if it were designed from the ground up never to allow remote policy to be enforced against its owner? So this gets worse. It gets worse as we see a kind of bizarro world application of best practices from security. So what do we do in good security? Well, we have renewability, right? We say security is a process, not a product. Eventually our security will be compromised. When it is compromised, we need to patch it. So what does that mean when you're designing an anti-copying system, an anti-user system? It means that at times, not at the user's discretion, their devices will be updated to revoke things that run on their computers, right? To change the rules that govern the use of their own devices. And not surprisingly, the revocation is never used to make the rules more liberal, right? It's a noose that tightens in one direction. So, for example, if you owned a TiVo about a year ago, you had a device that could record any show ever aired. Then TiVo pushed out a non-discretionary security update. And that security update came from a company called Macrovision. And what it did was it changed your TiVo into something that responded to a flag called CGMSA. And that flag broadcast signals would say no recording, or recording only for 24 hours, or recording for 7 days. Now, there's no law about whether or not you can or can't record shows that are flagged record once, record for 24 hours, record for 7 days, no record. That's not the copyright law. This was a device rule that was established. It's like, imagine if your email had at the bottom of it a flag that said no forward equals 1, and then you could make a law that everyone who made a mailer had to look for that flag, and when they saw it, turn off the forwarding button, right? So Macrovision was pushed out onto the devices owned by TiVo users, and suddenly they had a device that was less capable. And that's not unusual, that's the norm. For example, most recently we saw the Fair Use for Windows Media patch pushed out by Microsoft, fastest patch in Microsoft history. And what they did was they revoked something that users had figured add to their devices. So if you owned a Windows machine and some Windows Media, you might have downloaded some software to let you do more with your music. Now, from a user's perspective, that's not a security problem, right? You don't worry that it's only you've suddenly found yourself with the ability to load your Windows Media music on your iPod. You don't say, I wish that someone will come along and patch this security vulnerability that allows me to do more with the music I paid for. But Microsoft pushed the patch out and advised users that this was patch. They actually pushed it out a little faster than they pushed out the patch for the vector graphics vulnerability that just came along. Although, to their credit, they did push out a patch for the vector graphics vulnerability ahead of Patch Tuesday. But they broke all speed records to get this patch out. And then the other elements of the tech industry that are being exported elsewhere, one is robustness, this idea that technology should be designed so that it's not user modifiable. Those of you who work in source, those of you who work in the science of security, that is to say, disclosure, peer review, and analysis, understand that the ability to modify and understand your own equipment is fundamental to science. For 500 years, what passed for science was alchemy. And an alchemist was a lot like a scientist, except he never disclosed what he discovered. And as a result, for 500 years, every alchemist learned for himself that drinking mercury was bad for you. Right? When alchemists began to publish, they did, the Dark Ages ended, and the Enlightenment began, and science arose. When you design devices so that their users can't modify, understand, or publish their results from them, then you start to claw back those vital norms that characterize the progress. And then finally, we're exporting anti-competition, the anti-competition that arose when we had software that was very siloed, and we had a lot of code obfuscation, and we had non-standardized data. We're exporting that into hardware universes and other universes. So if you buy an iPod and you buy $300 worth of iTunes music, Steve Jobs doesn't really care if you copy that music, right? Steve Jobs' DRM is not about making sure you don't copy the songs that you buy. It's about luring in the music industry so that when you have bought $300 worth of iPod music, you add $300 to the cost of switching to another brand, right? So I'm a long user. I'm in the process of switching to Ubuntu but on a ThinkPad, but I've got a sad Mac tattooed on my shoulder. I got my first Apple in 1979, and even I know that Apple hasn't always made the best hardware in the market, right? I remember the Performas, right, as do many of you, right? It is absurd to believe that Apple will always make the best iPods. We know for a certainty, I'll bet you a testicle, though not necessarily one of mine, that at some point in the future, some manufacture an iPod-like device that's better than Apple. And it'll probably cost about what an iPod does, between $100 and $250. But the cost of switching from an iPod to a Creative Labs iPod will be $250 plus the cost of all the iTunes music you've ever paid for. Because what Apple gets with anti-copying software is the right to sue Creative if they make compatible hardware. So this is coming soon to a productivity suite and an operating system. You've probably seen the Microsoft ads with the dinosaurs. I can't believe I sent that email to the whole company, right? That they're proposing in the new versions of Office what they call information rights management. And this is like anti-copying stuff for your own stuff. And the idea is that you can send out email or other documents that you can control the printing, forwarding, copying, and ongoing reading of. So you can revoke the ongoing right to read a document. And the idea is that you've got a trusted client that makes a round trip to a key server and says, can I have a key to decrypt this document? And the key server says, sure, here are the rules that you have to respect when you decrypt it. So disable printing, disable copying, disable screenshotting, whatever. And when you're done, you have to discard the key. So you have to come back to me for another look at it. Now, the key word here is trusted. If you're not a trusted client and you get the key, you don't have to